Hello, and welcome to the RLAS webinar series on understanding bullying. This webinar is part of the research study implementing school nursing strategies to reduce LGBTQ+ adolescent suicide, or RLAS. The study is funded by the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Jen Jefferson, and I'm one of the RLAS instructional coaches, and I'm also the founder of Prevention at Play. My areas of specialty include gender and sexuality, bullying, suicide prevention, team building, project management, grant writing, and curriculum development. I'm also a provider of experiential activities and workshops tailored to youth, educators, school administrators, and staff, and especially LGBTQ+ populations. So for this workshop, we're going to give an overview of what bullying is. We're also going to focus a little bit on how that affects LGBTQ+ or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, etc. youth. So after viewing this webinar, you'll be able to cite the prevalence of bullying experienced by LGBTQ+ youth in schools. You'll be able to differentiate bullying from peer conflict, describe the relationship between bias and bullying, and identify strategies shown to be successful in preventing and addressing bullying behaviors. We're going to begin with a quick little clip. It is a spoken word poet, and it'll kind of get us in the right framework of mind to be thinking about bullying. So this is an 8-minute video, and it will begin playing automatically.
When I was a kid, I used to think that pork chops and karate chops were the same thing. I thought they were both pork chops. And because my grandmother thought it was cute, and because they were my favorite, she let me keep doing it. Not really a big deal. One day, before I realized fat kids are not designed to climb trees, I fell out of a tree and bruised the right side of my body. I didn't want to tell my grandmother about it because I was scared I'd get in trouble for playing somewhere I shouldn't have been. A few days later, the gym teacher noticed the bruise and I got sent to the principal's office. From there, I was sent to another small room with a really nice lady who asked me all kinds of questions about my life at home. I saw no reason to lie. As far as I was concerned, life was pretty good. I told her whenever I'm sad, my grandmother gives me karate chops. This led to a full-scale investigation, and I was removed from the house for 3 days until they finally decided to ask how I got the bruises. News of this silly little story quickly spread through the school, and I earned my first nickname, Pork Chop. To this day, I hate pork chops. I'm not the only kid who grew up this way. Surrounded by people who used to say that rhyme about sticks and stones. As if broken bones hurt more than the names we got called, and we got called them all. So we grew up believing no one would ever fall in love with us. That we'd be lonely forever. That we'd never meet someone to make us feel like the sun was something they built for us in their tool shed. So broken heartstrings bled the blues as we tried to empty ourselves so we would feel nothing. Don't tell me that hurts less than a broken bone. That an ingrown life is something surgeons can cut away. That there's no way for it to metastasize, it does. She was 8 years old. Our first day of grade 3 when she got called ugly. We both got moved to the back of class so we would stop getting bombarded by spitballs. But the school halls were a battleground where we found ourselves outnumbered day after wretched day. We used to stay inside for recess because outside was worse. Outside we'd have to rehearse running away or learn to stay still like statues, giving no clues that we were there in grade 5. They tipped a sign to the front of her desk that read, "Beware of dog." To this day, despite a loving husband, she doesn't think she's beautiful because of a birthmark that takes up a little less than half her face. Kids used to say she looks like a wrong answer that someone tried to erase but couldn't quite get the job done. And they'll never understand that she's raising 2 kids whose definition of beauty begins with the word mom. Because they see her heart before they see her skin. Because she's only ever always been amazing. He was a broken branch grafted onto a different family tree. Adopted. Not because his parents opted for a different destiny. He was 3 when it became a mixed drink of 1 part left alone and 2 parts tragedy. Started therapy in 8th grade. Had a personality made up of tests and pills. Lived like the uphills were mountains and the downhills were cliffs. 4/5 suicidal, a tidal wave of antidepressants, and an adolescence being called pauper. 1 part because of the pills, 99 parts because of the cruelty. He tried to kill himself in grade 10 when a kid who could still go home to mom and dad had the audacity to tell him, get over it. As if depression is something that can be remedied by any of the contents found in a first aid kit. To this day, he is a stick of TNT lit from both ends. Could describe to you in detail the way the sky bends in the moments before it's about to fall. And despite an army of friends who all call him an inspiration, he remains a conversation piece between people who can't understand. Sometimes being drug-free has less to do with addiction and more to do with sanity. We weren't the only kids who grew up this way. To this day, kids are still being called names. The classics were, hey stupid, hey spaz. Seems like every school has an arsenal of names getting updated every year. And if a kid breaks in a school and no one around chooses to hear, do they make a sound? Or they're just background noise from a soundtrack stuck on repeat when people say things like kids can be cruel? Every school was a big top circus tent, and the pecking order went from acrobats to lion tamers, from clowns to carnies. All of these miles ahead of who we were freaks. Lobster claw boys and bearded ladies. Oddities juggling depression and loneliness, playing solitaire, spin the bottle, trying to kiss the wounded parts of ourselves and heal. But at night, while the others slept, we kept walking the tightrope. It was practiced, and yes, some of us fell. But I want to tell them that all of this is just debris left over when we finally decide to smash all the things we thought we used to be. And if you can't see anything beautiful about yourself, get a better mirror. Look a little closer. Stare a little longer. Because there's something inside you that made you keep trying despite everyone who told you to quit. You built a cast around your broken heart and signed it yourself. You signed it. They were raw. Because maybe you didn't belong to a group or a clique. Maybe they decided to pick you last for basketball or everything. Maybe you used to bring bruises and broken teeth to show and tell but never told. Because how can you hold your ground if everyone around you wants to bury you beneath it? You have to believe that they were wrong. They have to be wrong. Why else would we still be here? We grew up learning to cheer on the underdog because we see ourselves in them. We stem from a root planted in the belief that we are not what we were called. We are not abandoned cars stalled out and sitting empty on some highway. And if in some way we are, don't worry. We only got out to walk and get gas. We are graduating members from the class of we made it. Not the faded echoes of voices crying out names will never hurt me. Of course, they did. But our lives will only ever always continue to be a balancing act that has less to do with pain and more to do with beauty.
So I hope you enjoyed that short clip. Many of you might be recalling memories of when you were a young person or dealing with the young people in your life. But I like to show this video at the beginning of presentations because I feel like we can think about bullying, we can talk about it, we can talk about the stats, we can keep it all very cognitive and just up in our heads. But it's really important to kind of connect that piece of that feeling, just to put us a little bit in the mind frame of what it's like for some of our students, and that this is their reality. So also, by the way, that video is available on YouTube. You can Google "To This Day," and it's actually a great video to show to your colleagues, but also for young people. Teenagers have been really impressed with this video, and it really kind of connects with them, especially the fact that it's spoken word. So I encourage you to show it to young people also. So as we're talking about bullying, bullying has changed from when many of us were in school. It's a lot more intense, it's a lot more severe, and it's a lot more pervasive. So I'm going to review a few statistics that kind of support that. thought, but also, the National Education Association has said that it's become more lethal and occurred more frequently in the previous 2 decades, indicating that it's increasing. And the National Association of School Psychologists says it's the most common form of violence. And really, bullying is a form of violence, and it's important to not forget that it really is a form of violence. So when we look at bullying and the climate that it creates, it doesn't affect just the student that is being targeted. So it most directly affects them. It has the biggest impact on them. But it also really affects the entire rest of the school. The other folks who are the bystanders, the upstanders, those who are just witnessing it, those who are worried that they'll be next. So it really affects everyone. In addition to just this overall climate of fear, it gets in the way of learning because it can be a big distraction. If students are worried and thinking and preoccupied about being targeted, or their friend being targeted, or the situations going on around them connected to bullying, it's hard to focus. So it's hard to do your algebra if you're worried about what's going to happen when you leave class. So it definitely has a direct impact on GPAs. If you're worried what's going to happen when you go to school, it's really easy to then choose not to go to school. So truancy rates are higher, dropout, which then leads to dropout rates being higher. Just overall stress is higher. The violence that folks are experiencing and witnessing is higher. And overall, it can increase the likelihood of depression, loneliness, anxiety, low self-esteem, and even suicidal ideation. So what we know about those who are getting bullied is that the youth that are getting bullied are more likely to be depressed, be lonely, be anxious, have low self-esteem, feel unwell, and think about suicide. But if we shift to those who bully other youth, so the kids who are doing the bullying, they're 5 times more likely to end up engaging in delinquent behavior and 3 to 4 times more likely to abuse substances. And then if you take the subset of population that is bullied and bullies others, they're at the highest risk out of everyone for depression, anxiety, and that risky and delinquent behavior. So we're having lots of different groups of young people, regardless of what end they're on of the bullying situation, being really negatively affected by this climate of bullying. Something I'd like to note as I talk about that, so in the last slide I referenced that some youth are both bullied and bullied others, and it's really important that we move away from using the term bully. We refer to, oh, that kid is the bully, because when we label that young person like that, it's labeling their identity. It's saying who they are, and really bullying is not an identity. It's a behavior. And so we want to talk about the behavior and the choices that young person is making, which of course are absolutely unacceptable. But instead of labeling them as a bully, which is easy to then take on, absorb, and hard to make positive changes because that's your name tag, that's who you are now. So instead, to talk about their behavior, to talk about the student who is bullying, or the student participating in bullying, or the bullying behavior. And so we're really talking about those actions, because actions are so much easier to change than changing your entire identity. So I really encourage you to try to work that into your vocabulary and make that shift and talk about that behavior and use that person-first language. So some groups are more targeted than others. So a lot of times it's the students who are a little bit different than kind of your average student, right? Your most common students. So if we look at folks who have disabilities, they're more targeted. And keep in mind that that's both visible disabilities as well as invisible disabilities. So we can't always look at someone and see their disability. So that's important to keep in mind. And then students who have either real or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity issues are also targeted. And the reason it's important that I say real or perceived is that if you take a young man who perhaps identifies as straight, but is maybe smaller in size, or is slightly more effeminate, or is on the cheerleading squad, or does something that is a little bit outside those binary boxes of what, the stereotype of what a heterosexual teenage boy should be, they are often targeted as well. So it's about their real or perceived sexual orientation and gender identity, not just how they actually identify. Both are really important to consider. So this is the latest data from the New Mexico Youth Risk and Resiliency Survey, and this is comparing lesbian, gay, bisexual students with straight students. You will know it does say LGB. Right now in the state of New Mexico, we don't collect data in the YRS around our transgender students. We don't ask a question on gender identity. We do ask our high school students a question on sexual orientation that they can self-disclose. But we don't yet have that information on the T. So that's why that's missing from here. But if we do look at the LGB students, they are featured there in the lime green. You can see that in all areas of bullying, that they are significantly more affected, and in most cases, at least 2 times more affected. So they miss school almost twice as much as straight students. They are bullied in general almost twice as much, actually more than twice as much. And then also they are electronically bullied twice as much as well. And electronically bullied is via text, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, any of the electronic media that is used for bullying, both on campus and off campus. So you can see that our LGB students are suffering from bullying at much greater rates than our straight students, and that's why we take a moment to kind of feature that and focus on this. Also looking at their mental health, also are suffering and struggling more than the straight students. They are more sad and depressed. They attempt suicide more, and they seriously consider suicide more as well. So let's dig in right now to what bullying is. So there's 3 main pieces of the definition of what bullying is and what makes something bullying versus just harassment or bad behavior or any other descriptor of that behavior. So the first one is that there's an imbalance of power. And so that can show up in a lot of different ways. It can be a larger person picking on a smaller person. It could be someone picking on a larger person who has a higher weight than they do. It could be somebody who has a higher social status. They're more popular. It could be someone who's older, someone who is more intellectually able than others, someone who is able-bodied and someone who is disabled. So there's many different ways to define that power, but that's the most important thing. There's an imbalance of power there. The second piece is that it's on purpose. So it didn't just happen on accident, that the person doing the bullying was intentionally targeting the other person. And the last one is that it's repeated, or there's a significant threat that the person being targeted believes it will be repeated. So 3 main pieces: imbalance of power, on purpose, and repeated. So taking that definition and now looking at the difference between peer conflict and bullying. So a lot of times we, as adults, will see a situation happening between young people, and you can't always tell immediately what's going on. You often can tell something doesn't feel right, something doesn't look right, something doesn't sound right. But many times it takes some investigation or asking some questions or doing some observations to really figure out, well, is this peer conflict or bullying? And in a lot of cases, you just handle it, you stop it, and then you can try to figure out which it is and therefore how it gets handled, both in just working with the students as well as the actual disciplinary procedures at the school. So in peer conflict versus bullying, you have that equal power. Remember, in bullying, there's that imbalance of power. And on the slide, it says not friends with a little question mark, because a lot of times, especially our young ladies, it can be confusing. They say, oh, but she's my friend. And if many times as adults, we will look at that and say, well, that's not a real friendship. But sometimes for those young people, they're really trying to sort out what that means, and maybe they want to be accepted into that friend group. So that's why that question mark of, well, not friends, but maybe. But I would say that's not a true and healthy friendship. So there's that imbalance of power, typically repeated, versus peer conflict just happens once in a while. And on purpose, peer conflict is accidental. Typically with bullying, it's relatively serious, and that can be emotional and physical harm. So we need to keep in mind the impact that being bullied over and over and over again does to someone. Then next, if we look at the reactions, is that the target will often has a strong reaction. They are really upset, their feelings are hurt, they're scared, they're having a lot of emotions. And the person doing the bullying, or the aggressor, is having little or no reaction. They have more of a flat affect. They think it's funny, it's no big deal, oh, I was just kidding, right? So that they're not their emotional reactions are different. Whereas in a peer conflict, when two people are fighting over something or over some specific problem, they're usually both really upset and really amped up. And that leads us kind of into the next one, that they're trying to either gain material things, you took this or that was mine, or that they're trying to solve some sort of problem. And then the last one is just about remorse. And so typically the person doing the bullying often has a lack of empathy and doesn't really feel that bad. And they may apologize, but often you can watch them and you can see that they don't really feel that bad. They don't really feel guilty. They're maybe just upset they got caught, kind of that sort of thing. Whereas in peer conflict, once the conflict is at least settled a bit, many times both of those folks are really upset and feel really bad about what's happening or what did just happen. And they'll often, sometimes with coaching, will take responsibility for their part in it. Whereas in a bullying situation, typically the person doing the bullying will not take responsibility. So why do young people bully? Well, there's a few different reasons rather, and here's just a few. One of the main reasons is to get power, right? They're trying to get attention. They're trying to have power, social power, whatever kind of power that is feeding them in the moment, so that they're often trying to get power. Sometimes they just want to be seen as popular by their friends, so they're getting attention to gain popularity. Sometimes they really just want the thing the other person has, and so they're going to bully them and take it and get it. Many times, the person doing the bullying is having some challenges at home. They're seeing a lot of conflict in their house or in their family, or they're getting bullied in other venues. So then they're turning, that's a learned behavior. So then they are turning to try to gain power and control, and then they're acting out as the aggressor and doing the bullying. And sometimes they're just copying what they've seen in media, what an older sibling has done, somebody they perceive to be cool, and they've seen them do this, so then they emulate that, and then they're doing similar things. So those are just some of the reasons that young people bully. So digging into the types of bullying, there's 5 main types. The first one is physical. This is usually the one that comes to mind for most people first. So think of hitting and pushing and shoving, tripping, even destroying property, even physically threatening with a weapon. And again, some of these are gonna overlap. So threatening with a weapon, that can be physical, but that also can lead us into 2, which is verbal. A lot of times that typically is the name calling and the teasing and the making fun of and the mocking, sometimes intimidating phone calls, sometimes leaving nasty and mean notes. Then the third one is social bullying. This is often what we think of when Mean Girls, the idea of Mean Girls comes to mind. Both boys and girls both participate in this, but girls tend to do it a little bit more. And that's the gossiping and the spreading rumors, which can overlap with cyberbullying, but sending especially rumors via text, publicly humiliating somebody, making them really embarrassed, or excluding someone and inviting, every girl in the class to a birthday party except this one girl, or not letting you sit at the only seat left on the bus or at the lunch table, etc. The next one is intimidation. Oops, hang on, let me get you back. There we go. Okay, so intimidation. So again, that's the threats. That can also be graffiti, or signing something on their locker, writing something in the bathroom, coercion, taking things, playing a trick, the public dare, like daring somebody to do something, challenging them in front of others. And then the last one is that cyberbullying, and that's any type of bullying that uses technology. And this one often overlaps with some of the other ones. It can be social, it can be intimidation, it can be verbal. So these aren't cut and dry, they're all very connected, but I list these out to help us remember that it's not just physical and it's not just verbal, that there's many nuanced ways in that these show up in our schools. So if we look at why youth get bullied, typically it's because they're not fitting into that stereotypical norm. And so often youth get bullied for being too fat, being called a slut, a prude, not being athletic enough, being called a fag, not being documented, not wearing the latest, greatest name brand clothes, not having access to their own transportation, either being not smart enough or being too smart, having a visible and physical disability, not speaking English well enough, according to their peers. So these are just a handful, a smattering of examples of like what's being said to young people, what the topic they're getting bullied on is. So I'm going to circle back to this in a second, but the reason that young folks are getting bullied on these things is that all of these are value judgments. And that leads us into bias, where it's this belief that some people are better than others, that being, in our society in general, that being thin is better than being heavy, being, conventionally, stereotypically pretty is better, and for women, having long hair is better than having short hair. So it's based on stereotypes typically. And it's often connected to oppression. So the difference, though, is that we all have biases. We all have them. They come up for us. They're often unconscious. If you just kind of not like somebody for some reason that you can't identify, it could be coming from a place of bias. It's kind of those subtle judgments that you make in your head that essentially we were conditioned and trained to do by our families, our society, our media. And so it's not intentional. And so the piece about biases that are so important is to recognize when our biases are coming up and then to not act on those, to not implement those biases, as an adult, or if we can watch among young people when they're having their biases. Because if we can get at the root of that, I believe that is one of the best ways that we can actually make a difference and change the climate of bullying. And bias is different, too, than oppression. So the isms are oppression, racism, sexism, heterosexism, classism, ableism, sizeism. Those are all oppressions or types of oppression. And really, it's connected to bias, but you have bias, and when you have power in that dominant culture group, when you have both the bias and the power, then that's how it can be oppression. But for bias, we all have them. So again, it's just about recognizing them, checking those as much as possible. So if you look at these, take a look at this list, and which one of these are connected to bias? And so if you had to go through and circle them, think about which ones you would circle. And if I were doing it, these are the ones that I would circle. So really all of these are connected to bias, and they're all essentially value judgments, that somebody is not good enough because they're to this or not enough this. So that's the connection to bias. If we move into the roles of bullying incidents, there's kind of three main groups. The last two are kind of combined into one group. And so if we look at the target, or the person getting bullied, and I prefer the term target over victim, but the person getting targeted, getting bullied, right? And then there's the aggressor or aggressors, the people doing the bullying, right? So you get the person getting targeted, the person or the persons doing the bullying, and then you have all the other folks, and those are the bystanders and the upstanders. So the difference between all these witnesses, essentially, is that bystanders just stand by. And they, for whatever reason, which we'll review in a minute, but they don't get involved. But upstanders, in some way, they get involved. They try to change the situation. They try to get help. So bystanders stand by, and upstanders stand up. So we look at why don't bystanders get involved. There's a lot of really real reasons. Is one, they may just be afraid of being next, or being retaliated against by the people doing the bullying. They might see this situation and have no idea what to do, so they're just kind of frozen. They might see what's happening and be afraid if they tell someone or intervene that it's just going to make the situation worse for the person getting targeted. They might worry about losing their social status, not being as cool or popular, and it negatively impacting their life at school. They might not go tell an adult because they don't think an adult's going to help, because a lot of times young people will come to us and maybe they don't get the kind of help that they want, right? So they might not believe that the adults around them are going to help. And they might just look at it and say, you know what, that's not my problem. I don't need to get involved. And so I think the more we talk to young people and help them shift some of those ideas and then also teach them what they can do, then they're more likely to actually change the bullying situation. Now, we as adults have responsibility and ability to stop bullying situations, but oftentimes we're not seeing it happening. And so the more that we can talk to young people about being an upstander, they're the actual more powerful force in reducing the amount of bullying that's happening and stopping it actually more quickly. So one thing I like to tell students and young people that I work with is the difference between tattling and telling. Now, tattling and telling is often phraseology that we use with young people. You might have heard this said to you. You might have even said this to your own children or small children. And the difference that, so tattling, and we've all heard, oh, don't be a tattletale, stop tattling. Tattling is just about getting somebody in trouble. It's something that doesn't really matter. It's not that big a deal, but we just want to get the other person in trouble. You know, he looked at me, she looked at me, she took the red crayon. You know, we think about little kids a lot of times, right? So that's just getting someone in trouble for the point of getting them in trouble. And then telling is about getting someone out of trouble, right? Helping someone and getting them out of that troublesome situation they're in. Now, granted, somebody might have a consequence, so technically somebody might get in trouble, but the point is not to get the person doing the bullying in trouble and get them a consequence. The point is just to help the person getting targeted. So tattling is about getting someone in trouble. Telling is about getting someone out of trouble. So when young folks hear that, you know, they don't usually use the word tattling, especially as high schoolers. They're going to use narc, snitch, rat, etc. So you can adjust the language there, but most of us know what tattling is because most of it have had it said to us. So helping folks kind of get that motivation to help, to want to be an upstander, I think is the first piece. And then the second piece of helping them make that change is helping them understand what they can do. So the motivation, but then actually the skills and the knowledge. So here are some ways that upstanders can take action. And I like sharing this with young people. Is one, they can go tell an adult. Most of our young people at least know a few adults in school that they trust, that they could tell. They can recruit other upstanders. I like to explain to young folks, if I were to have a pencil, regular old pencil, I could probably just snap it in my hands and be not that hard. But if I had a whole wad of pencils, if I had 10 pencils in my hand all together and I tried to break them, I wouldn't be able to. And so really imparting that idea of strength in numbers, and that if they get other upstanders, they're going to be even more powerful, and it you know, likely is much safer too. They could say something. They could just call out and be like, hey, man, knock that off, or that's not cool. They can just interrupt and say something, say, leave them alone, leave her alone, go away, you know, just say whatever feels appropriate. They could comfort the target. So they could say, hey, come over here with me, or, you know, why don't you sit with us today? Offer that target some sort of support, and include them perhaps. And sometimes the young people, it's actually one of their friends who is doing the bullying. So especially if it doesn't feel effective to intervene in the moment and say something, another strategy is to talk to that person later and be like, you know, man, when you were teasing so-and-so and you were, you know, making fun of this or making fun of that, you know, I think you really hurt her feelings and it's really not cool. So they can help the person who's doing the bullying save a little bit of face, and that may be in a more effective way for them to change their behavior. And then the last, our young people are really funny. A lot of them are really good at humor. And so that's often a great way, is for them to just use humor to change that power dynamic and kind of take the wind out of the person doing the bullying sails, if you will. I do like to mention to young people to consider their levels of risk. So if I'm walking up to two teenage boys, even though I'm an adult and I see something going on, it may not be safe for me to step in and say, hey, knock it off, right? That may put myself in danger. So it might be better for me to, instead of, you know, say something, is to go find other adults, go get other upstanders, do something different. And so I encourage young folks to think about, how risky is this? How comfortable are you? And that's why it helps to have so many different options, is to choose something that feels, you know, safe enough that they're going to keep their bodies safe. And even if it's a little hard to step up and do that and step out of their comfort zone, it's something that's doable. And I think that sets them up to be more likely to be able to take action as an upstander. So for us adults, when we see bullying happening, the first thing that we need to do is to stop the bullying. The second thing that we need to do is to kind of label it as bullying behavior if we know that it's bullying behavior. And again, remember when I talked about peer conflicts, sometimes we see what's happening and we don't know if it's bullying or conflict. But either way, stopping it, referring to the actions, and then especially saying, this is against school rules and why. Giving the person who's getting bullied support in a way that doesn't draw too much attention to them, helps them get self-control, calm down, save face, and feel really safe in that moment. Talking to those witnesses, those bystanders, finding out what might have happened, but also taking that moment to talk about how they could intervene the next time or if they see it again. And if by talking to the bystanders, it gets clear about what was going on and it's appropriate to impose consequences immediately in that situation, then it's a great time to do that. Sometimes it's not clear and it takes a little bit of time to suss out what really happened. And if you have that gut feeling or something one of the witnesses says that you think it might be bullying, then the more information you can gather then by the other witnesses who saw things, that can help you figure that out and handle it later. And kind of as a short-term, in the meantime, is just increase supervision. Keep a few more adults around. Keep an eye on the person getting targeted. And if any of those bystanders were helping, then really reward that as a way to prevent it from happening the next time. So after the fact, you want to continue to follow up with both the person who was bullied as well as those who were bullied. Notifying the parents as appropriate. And one of the reasons I say this, especially in connection with LGBTQ plus young folks, is that not all of our students are safe at home. Not all of them are out at home. So we really want to honor their confidentiality while also sharing with parents what parents need to know. There are ways to, if a kid's not out and you call his parents, and his parents don't know that he's gay, then, you can talk about what happened and the consequences, but, perhaps it doesn't have to be shared that, he was being made fun of because he was talking to another boy or because they were calling him a fag. So there are some ways that you can work with the student to notify the parents as needed, but also really keep them safe in their home environment and respect the confidentiality to either their gender identity or their sexual orientation. The students who get bullied, they may need some time later to talk about what happened and vent and be upset, and also get support. Remember, because if you saw all those instances of bullying, it can be really pervasive and it can really get into someone's head and really, really, really affect someone. So they often are going to need support to process and move through some of this, especially if this is happening in their day-to-day life. And then the student who is doing the bullying, they might need a lot of help recognizing what part of the behavior was wrong, that it wasn't, just funny or just a joke. They may have a hard time feeling empathetic, so they might need help with that. And because they don't feel empathetic, they might have a hard time taking responsibility for their behavior. They may even say the other person, deserved it, or, so really working with the person who's doing the bullying too, to help them change that behavior, possibly even make amends, is what's going to change it in the future versus just suspending them or just kicking them out of school. So really working with that student to make that behavior change. So I often get teachers and administrators and nurses and counselors talk to me about just how hard it is to support folks going through this, and sometimes they just don't know what to say or what to do. And so I want to share probably my most favorite video with you. It's one on empathy, and it's by Brene Brown. And so this can be really helpful just when you need to support a student, to just kind of keep this in your mind. It's also a great tool to show to students about empathy or to help upstanders see this, to help them be better upstanders. And so with that, it's about 2 minutes long, but please enjoy this video by Brene Brown.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here. And you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
I think with that video, it just points out that empathy is one of the best ways, well, really to support anyone, but it's one of the best ways to help our students, and it's really the best way to teach our students to support their peers as well. That's also available on YouTube. You just Google empathy, Brene Brown, and it'll come right up. So with this empathy and developing empathy, especially as I was just talking about, working with a student who's doing bullying, doing the bullying behavior, just kicking them out of school, that's actually zero tolerance behavior or policies. So zero tolerance policies are pretty common. They are beginning to get phased out across the country. It's one of those things where they actually kind of came from a good place of saying, we don't tolerate bullying here, we're not going to allow it. It was folks really trying to seriously take a stand against bullying. But unfortunately, as we know, it's a learned behavior, and so when we just impose punishment and consequences and kick the kids out of school and move them to a different school or refer them to criminal justice, it doesn't actually help that young person who is participating in the bullying, doing the bullying. It doesn't help them have those attitude changes and therefore leading to those behavior changes. So if we're able to help them see the impact they had, to help them understand, how it made the other person feel and develop that empathy, take responsibility, they're more likely to change their behavior. And so really, we don't just want to get rid of these students. We want to help these students change their behavior. So the zero tolerance is really just very punitive. But restorative justice is about correcting that behavior in appropriate ways, making reparations, rebuilding relationships, and ultimately it's about responsibility and accountability. Now, something that's really close to restorative justice is, peer mentoring or, having students talk, one-on-one and work it out. And in that is very effective in many venues, but it's not something that we want to do in a bullying situation, because when we pull the person getting bullied and the person doing the bullying into the same room, it makes the target even more vulnerable than they already were. They likely can't be honest. So in most cases, we really don't want to be doing that. So restorative justice is slightly different from those other peer mentoring, peer helping type programs, which are also incredibly effective, great for conflict, really great evidence-based methodology, just not in applying to bullying situations. So another thing that we as adults can do is advocate for model policies and best practices in our schools. So look at your district policies or your school policies. What are the policies on bullying? Who's included in that? Are LGBTQ plus young people included? Typically that's expressed as gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. Are they protected in there? You know, are there any sort of prevention efforts required? Do, you know, teachers have to do any lessons, or, you know, does it happen in health class? Is there a second step program? Any of the different ways that that can happen, are there any prevention efforts? That also includes, are staff trained? And are staff trained on the bullying policy for them to understand it? And then for the intervention is, so when the bullying situation happens, do staff know what to do? Do they know how to handle it? Do you actually even have a form? Is it the same form as, you know, a physical fight, or is there a specific form for bullying, or is there an overall form but there's a way to indicate that it is bullying? And then who does that form go to? What happens after that? Who does the follow-up? So just knowing what those intervention strategies are, and then also knowing, well, what happens to the student after, you know, the investigation is done? Are they just kicked out of school? Do you have zero tolerance policies so, you know, they're out? Or do they end up in counseling and in ways that can actually change that, you know, behavior that they're doing? So these are great ways to try to advocate from the administrative end, is what are the policies, what are the prevention efforts, and what are the intervention strategies? So I encourage you to go dig through your policies and procedures manuals and find out where your school or district lays on those things. So if we look at best practices, here are some of the best practices that are recommended out there. And again, SAMHSA's got some great resources about bullying prevention programs that you can look at, and even evidence-based model programs that you can purchase the curriculum. But these are just kind of overall general things to do as best practices. So the first one is really encouraging your staff, especially, to use person-first language, not labeling that student as the bully. Looking at your own biases and then encouraging others to look at their biases and point out when biases are coming up for folks. Point out when you see discrimination or oppression happening. Empower those upstanders. So have them want to make a change and then teach them the skills to make a change. Even if you just witness a student standing up for another student, giving them some positive recognition, say, wow, hey, that was a great job the way you stood up for that person. That will really help them continue to feel empowered and continue to be an upstander in the future. It also sends a message to the other students that hear that that's a positive thing to do. Get your school to move away from zero tolerance policies and use more restorative justice practices and not that peer mediation, for bullying at least. And then last, make sure this is a school-wide effort, that it's not just happening in health class, or it's not just happening at one grade level, or in the school or the district, that this is really happening school-wide, district-wide. It involves the parents, it involves the students, and obviously, of course, you know, the entire staff team. And really the entire staff team down to your folks who are custodians. They often hear a lot that the rest of the staff don't hear. Your cafeteria workers, especially your bus drivers, your coaches, really making sure that everyone is on the same page around reducing and preventing bullying as much as possible. I want to make some resource recommendations. So some great resources here. The federal government has one called stopbullying.gov. You can even check out what the New Mexico laws are. They have a little link there that is specific to New Mexico. But they have a lot of great resources for educators, parents, and students, and at multiple different grade levels. So there's a lot of great resources on background and information, how to handle things as a parent, what to do. So lots of great information there. The NEA has some great stuff, and you can check out their website to look at what some of their resources are. And then GLSEN, which you may not have heard of, that's the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network. They have some really good stuff around bullying prevention, and even some of those slur and derogatory terms that are being said, like, oh, don't be such a fag. things like that that are often used in bullying, but also can just be used in teasing. They've got some great strategies on, it's the Think Before You Speak campaign. So they've got some really great stuff up there that specifically protects LGBTQ plus youth, but really it protects all young people. And one thing I like to share with folks, sometimes I say, oh, well, you know, we don't want anyone to be bullied, so why do we need to focus on LGBTQ plus youth? And really it's because as the data shows that that's the most targeted group that there is, and any time that we make our schools, our environment, our community safer for one group, it makes it safer for all groups. So by focusing on our LGBTQ plus youth and our students with disabilities, the two most vulnerable and targeted groups, if we can make it a safer place for them, it's really going to make it a safer place for all of our students. I'd also like to thank our school nurse reviewers who gave input and feedback on this presentation, so many thanks to them. And then here's my contact info. Again, I'm one of the instructional coaches for this project. Feel free to reach out to me if you need some consultation or you have a question, or even if you just have a question about this webinar that you just viewed or need more resources, please feel free to reach out and I'd be happy to support you. And with that, that is the end of our webinar. Thank you so much for watching and good luck reducing bullying in your schools.